Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jeremy Goodwin. Halloween is next Thursday, which means that most of the Halloween-y stuff is happening this weekend. And you might put into that category the Twilight Tours at the Campbell House Museum, which are spruced up this year by the Mourning Society of St. Louis. That's mourning with an OU. They study and recreate mourning rituals from the past and will put their research to work tonight at the Campbell House when they reenact the 1879 wake of the man who lived there, the famed St. Louis fur trader Robert Campbell. So we are here with, I believe, the complete membership of the Mourning Society of St. Louis to learn more about what they're up to. It's a small but committed and busy group. We're here with Catherine Kazemchak, who, when not researching the Victorian era, works in the health insurance industry. John Avery is an avid historical researcher and historical reenactor and former funeral director.
Yes.
And Edna Dieterle, who is an honest-to-goodness nurse, but tonight at the Campbell House Museum, she'll be showing off some low-tech tools of the trade from the past, like leeches. Edna, thanks for coming in. Catherine, John, and Edna, thanks for coming in. And I do want to invite our listeners into this conversation. If you have a question or comment about this topic, give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Or you can send us a tweet at STL on air or email us, talk@stlpublicradio.org. Send a pigeon, but it'll have to be a quick one because we're just here for about 25 minutes. Catherine, John, and Edna, thanks for coming to talk about this. So I know you come at this from a deep interest in history and are serious about your work. The Halloween tie-in, intentionally or not, ends up making October a busy time for you, though, right? Is that right, John?
Very much so, yes.
Do you resist that connection to some extent?
No, we seem to just take on more and more every year.
Okay. Well, let's start first with what's going to actually happen tonight at the Campbell House Museum. Catherine, would you tell us what to expect?
Yeah, they'll get a brief overview about the history of the Campbell House and the family, and then they'll have a guide that takes them to room where they'll experience different aspects of 19th century mourning, including the wake, which will be the first thing that you see. But there'll be different exhibits all throughout the house about the time that they would be in mourning, the clothing that they would wear. And then we go into, on the second floor, medical treatments, death at home, all kinds of different aspects of what you would experience at that time when someone died at home.
All of that at the Campbell House?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. That's terrific. So you researched the funeral and wake of Robert Campbell specifically, Catherine?
Actually, the Campbell House had all of that ready for us, so we didn't have to do that much research. He was a well-known person at the time, and so there's much information out there about his funeral.
Edna, tell us about those leeches.
Everybody loves the leeches. Leeches were a common thing used back in the day to release blood. They felt that would help rid the body of illnesses. And so I do have leeches and talk about their uses. And they're used now in modern medicine for amputations and skin grafts. So they started using them back then, but we do use them today for methods that actually do work.
Wait, are leeches making a comeback?
I think in the medical field they are, yeah.
How would one use a leech in 2019?
In 2019, plastic surgeons use them if they're doing skin grafts, if it's not attaching well, because the leech draws blood to the surface, so it's going to bring blood to that area. If it's an amputated finger or something, they attach a leech, it draws blood to the surface. But now it's done in a sanitary, antiseptic way, not as in the 1860s when they would do them and there was no antibiotics, no antiseptics, and often people were overbled, which caused anemia and infection because they didn't wipe it off with an alcohol swab before they applied the leech and things like that. So it didn't really work as well back then. We're having better luck with them nowadays.
So some enhanced knowledge of microbiology and bacteria combined with some old-fashioned sucking prowess actually performs a medical function.
Yeah,
if you do it.
The leech is actually designed for that. Their saliva has an anticoagulant in it. It keeps the blood flowing. So they're totally designed for bleeding.
And so you'll have some on hand tonight for visitors?
There will be a jar of leeches there, yes.
Okay.
That's the most gruesome part of our tour.
Well, that's the thing. We talk about the Mourning Society, MOURN, studying the practices surrounding death of a previous age. Is there something morbid to that, John?
There really isn't, particularly if you look at the historical time. The event when it would happen in the home, and most always did happen in the home, unless it was
The event?
the event, the death. Unless there was a terrible accident or something like that outside of the home. We try to be as factual as we can be about that. Of course, being a retired funeral director, that part of it is pretty easy for me to be sure that what we do is correct, period correct.
So, looking at it in the big picture, what was different about the way that the St. Louis Society, American Society, dealt with and engaged with death 150 years ago? Was there a job funeral director, for instance?
There was for the undertaker. He would bring in mourning clothing, possibly if the family needed it, material to cover the mirrors and portraits, chairs, whatever the family might need at that time.
And what about dealing with the deceased? Wasn't that, I understood that was something that was handled more in the family.
Yes, into the 60s, it certainly was.
Into the 1960s?
No.
Oh,
1860s.
okay.
We live in the 1800s, so we know what we're talking about there. When there was a death in the home, usually would be in a bedroom, and the body would be washed and clothed and brought down to the parlor when the coffin had arrived from the undertaker, cabinet maker, or cabinet maker. There we go. So it was in the home. Everything was done in the home.
And how is that different from today?
Little or nothing. Well, other than hospice, but that's the closest we can come today to having a death in the home.
I think that nowadays the surviving family is insulated as much as possible from the particulars of just how to deal with a body that has recently expired.
Sure.
And that wasn't necessarily always the case.
No, there was not a family that was not touched by the death of a child or a youth or even an adult. And it occurred in the home with the whole family there. Mm-hmm. And we kind of do a disservice now in not letting the family be a part of all of that ritual.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you're a researcher and a collector of artifacts from the era. Mm-hmm. What sort of primary materials do you sift through to figure out how to put on a 1979 wake?
Well, we get objects that are authentic, that are really from the period. Some of those are postmortem photography, which we'll have there tonight.
Photographs of the deceased?
The deceased, yes, which sounds creepy to us, but again, when you look at it in perspective, back then they didn't have lots of pictures of their children. So a baby or a child might die, and you have no pictures of them. So of course you want a picture to remember that child by.
So there's lots of surviving photos of the dead people.
There are, and if you look for them, we find them in antique stores and boxes. When Catherine and I go antiquing, we'll sift through boxes, and these are all alive. There's no dead ones. We're looking for photographs of because sometimes they get mixed in, and they are treasures. They were treasures to a family, and now they're just sitting in a box in an antique store. So I like to give them a home.
And when you walk into a store like that, are you upfront about what you're looking for? Does it hit people the wrong way sometimes?
Yeah, we just kind of look quietly. Okay. We don't tell people what we're in there for because a lot of people don't understand it. We don't. That's one thing too. We do it respectfully. That's one thing our group prides ourselves on is that we do it respectfully and historically. It's not, we don't do the jumping out of coffins thing. We are respectful of the deceased and we're honoring their memory and we're showing people how they did it 150 years ago.
What else do you have in your personal collection?
I have hair work. Hair was another
hair work.
Human hair that would make into jewelry, rings, watch fobs, necklaces, earrings, which again sounds weird to us today, but most moms have a snip of their baby's first haircut taped in a baby book somewhere. The Victorians did the same thing. They just took it one step farther and would make it into jewelry pieces. Also big pictures, hair wreaths that look like flowers if you're not looking at them closely. So I also have some hair work items too.
And Catherine, you're just a great student of the era in general, right?
Yeah, I do my best to try to get back to primary sources so that we're pulling material out of things from the era. So it's as realistic as possible.
Are there good records in St. Louis for this era?
There are some in St. Louis. I would say a lot of my research is online too. So there's a lot of digital books available that are from that era, and a lot of newspapers and things like that. There's all kinds of things. If you know what to look for, you can compile a lot of information.
Yeah. Why the Victoria era? What interests you?
I don't know. I've always been interested in the 19th century and just culture in general. I think mourning is interesting because everybody can relate to having a loss. Most people have had that in their life, and it makes people, I don't know, have more empathy for people in the past if they are experiencing that same thing.
Are there myths about how people dealt with and encountered death in the 19th century that people these days have about the topic? Anything come to mind, John?
There were a lot of superstitions and a few of them have remained with us, but most of them now you just read in books.
Superstitions at the time?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What were some things people were very concerned with at the time that nowadays it wouldn't be?
The individuals were frightened, afraid that they would be buried alive. And so the coffins would be made with some sort of contraption, not all of them by any means.
The
but
glass
some
onion?
Of them pardon?
The glass onion? Is that what they call it? The little window?
Yes.
A window out?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And having a rope tied to a bell outside of the grave.
Oh.
Dead ringer.
That's where dead ringer comes from?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And there would be a rope up to a bell so that if you were stuck in there, you could ring it.
Yeah. In the hopes that someone would just by chance be walking through the cemetery to hear it, which they probably weren't. But there were a number of different kinds of contraptions. In fact, there were over 100 that were patented. And so this was...
contraptions for the mistakenly buried person to alert someone.
Yes. And it was a real concern. So those that could afford it would certainly buy coffins that had some sort of contraption attached to it.
And does that come out of just a more uncertain medical kind of environment that someone might be mistaken for deceased when they weren't?
Well, actually, the superstitions and the fear of death goes back centuries. In our country, back to the 1600s, there were rituals and superstitions that many of the immigrants would bring from the old country. And so these were not just American fears at all.
Well, when you read letters from this time period and earlier, right at the beginning, there's often a careful cataloging of the health of everybody in the household, right? Mm-hmm. Rebecca had a fever in September, but thank God she's recovered. Sarah has a cough now. And you just get the idea that the preservation of health is so important because the idea of death and sickness was just a little more mysterious. Sometimes these days I think we sometimes think we have more control over it than we do, but a real sense of powerlessness than compared to now, I think, in the past 150 years or so.
Yeah, and you were preserving the health of the whole family, too. They knew that once one person was ill, that there was a chance that everyone else was going to contract it. They didn't exactly know why, but that was understood at the time.
Yeah.
And so that was carefully monitored. And especially if you, had enough, if you were a wealthy family and you can afford medical treatment, you might seek that out at home. But sometimes that was worse for you than, your mother just taking care of you at home. That was dangerous also.
And if we're talking when Robert Campbell is being buried, that's 10 or 20 years after the Civil War, when 2% of the American population was killed. Was there just a different interaction with the idea and the specter of death in this era compared to now?
For sure. It became more culturally important because everybody had experienced a loss. You couldn't run into another person on the street who hadn't. And even just not war deaths, but there were epidemics after the war that were caused by overcrowding and things like that. So there was a cholera epidemic in St. Louis right after the war. And I think it became a cultural touchstone at that time, and it persisted for quite a while after. And it also became very commercially popular because, this is America. So, when people were interested in mourning, people came out with things that you could buy. And so that's where a lot of the things come from that we have now to show people are items that were made available to people because it was something that was happening at the time.
What are some newly available mourning paraphernalia?
Mourning jewelry became very popular.
Oh.
And the things that you would need to wear while you were in mourning became a little more structured. So you would have to go to a specific store to buy the fabrics that you would need, or the veils or handkerchiefs, or there's lists of goods that they would sell at specific stores for mourning. Because there was a company that would fill that role for you. So
a mourning commercial industry is
Yes.
something that was developing?
Yeah. And that's where a lot of the items that you see now in museums and things that Edna and I collect, those were produced because it was a very popular thing that was going on at the time.
Yeah. Well, we are talking with members of the Mourning Society of St. Louis ahead of their event tonight at the Campbell House Museum, 140 years this month after the death of Robert Campbell, who was born in Ireland, a frontiersman, settled in St. Louis, fur trader, had a nice house, apparently, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Beautiful house, yeah.
Yes.
So when Robert Campbell died, a prominent citizen, he breathes his last at home. What happens next?
It would be hoped that the body could be held for 3 days, emulating the 3 days Christ was in the tomb. Depending on the weather, if it was a terribly humid summer and hot, which we often have, the body might not last as long. They did not have, embalming. It started at the beginning of the Civil War in this country, but there were a lot of people that were very leery of it. Even well into the 70s and 80s, 1870s and 80s.
Must have seemed quite gruesome as a new technology.
It was. There was a lot of fear as to what and why it was being done. Mr. Lincoln approved the first Union officer to be embalmed, and that was the reason that embalming became popular, was to get the soldiers back to their home after they were being killed in the war. And so it became a little more accepted, but it really wasn't until the 20th century that it was a common practice.
Embalming.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So Robert Campbell would be embalmed, and then services at home?
We don't know. We have not run across that, and we're waiting for Catherine to come up with that information.
I don't know if they wrote that down.
So the weather, the inside of the house would have to be somewhat cool. They would not light a fire. They would close the drapes, keep it as cool in there as they could, and the body, they hoped, would last for the 3 days, and then have the funeral at the end of the 3 days after the wake.
John, let's talk about your collecting a bit. I understand that you acquired a horse-drawn hearse some years ago and rehabilitated it?
I did. It was my little baby. I completely restored it. It was in remarkably good condition, but I finished the restoration and used it in parades and first-person static experiences near the battlefield, Civil War battlefield.
How old is it?
The best we can come is it's the mid-60s, 1860s.
Mid-1860s.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And I finally decided that it was time to give it a new home. So Bellefontaine Cemetery purchased it, and they have it and will be refurbishing it again and hopefully using it for some of their burials.
Would a hearse be something that would only be used for a wealthy family?
No. Of course, some of the families, particularly in the country, they might have just looks like a buckboard. In the city, they would have some type of hearse. Mine was considered probably a poor man's hearse. It didn't have glass, and it was shorter than most of theirs, not nearly opulent as the more expensive ones, and those people that could afford those, which would have been the one that we'll talk about tonight. But it's quite an experience to own one. You think, well, it's another vehicle. Well, it's more than that. You really have a sense of what it must have been like in the 1800s to use a hearse like that and to process in a hearse like that, which I have done in the past. And so it's
horse-drawn.
Horse-drawn.
Yeah.
A single horse. So it's quite a small one.
You mentioned the Bellefontaine Cemetery.
Yes.
That's where the band got together, right? The Mourning Society of St. Louis. Edna?
We know each other before that. We were doing some events at other places before, but then our group as the Mourning Society of St. Louis came together there at Bellefontaine. They gave us the opportunity, and so we've been doing it for this is our 5th year. It's every first Saturday of October. We do something there, always a different topic.
At the cemetery?
It's at the cemetery. So we have reenactors in different locations doing educational bits, talking about different things relating to that era, and then we do in the chapel there, we do an actual funeral where we have a coffin and undertakers, and we carry the coffin out to the cemetery and do a graveside service and do as close to a burial as we can actually do. And it's an interesting experience. We sell out every year, and it's really educational.
What do you and your audiences, your participants, get out of all this? What do you think? Why do you do this?
Satisfaction and be able to share history with people to make it real for them. People look at pictures of people in the 1860s and just think they're flat images on a page, or those morbid Victorians, they were always obsessed with death. But when you do these things, you let people know why, that they were real people, they had real losses in their lives, and they mourned and grieved just like we do now. It was just how they did it then. So it's always fulfilling to educate people, to let them see this and walk away saying, oh, I didn't know about that. I learned something today.
And we're actually out of time. That flew by. It's been great having you in here. I want to thank Catherine Kazemchek, John Avery, and Edna Dieterle, the Mourning Society of St. Louis. Other counterparts in other cities?
No.
You're trailblazers.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us. It's been great chatting with you today.
Thank you.
This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.